Good morning. Welcome to this web event hosted by the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Philip Wallach. I study Congress and its place in America's separation of powers system here at AEI. I'm the proud author of this book, Why Congress, that I published earlier this year. And when I was writing that book, I imagined a speakership struggle. This was something we hadn't had in 100 years, but that we got in January of this year. But I never imagined anything quite as dramatic as what happened yesterday when we saw a Speaker of the House toppled in a dramatic roll call vote on the floor of the House of Representatives. Naturally, I was eager to gather some great thinkers about Congress to discuss those events for everyone today. And so that is what we will do. In the last 25 minutes or so of our time today, we will be taking audience questions. You can submit those by emailing Elizabeth Buckles at aei.org. That's Elizabeth with 2 S's. And you could also on X, formerly known as Twitter, post with the hashtag #NextForTheHouse, and we will pick up comments that way, comments and questions that way as well. So please send in your comments as we're talking, and we will get to those toward maybe 10:45 or 10:50 or so. Now, before we begin, I'm going to very briefly run through our panelists' biographies, and then we will get right into it. So just alphabetically, Matthew Green is Professor of American Politics at the Catholic University of America. He's the author of numerous books and articles, and his most recent books include Newt Gingrich, The Rise and Fall of a Party Entrepreneur, and Speaker of the House, A Study of Leadership. Kevin R. Kosar is my colleague here at AEI, a senior fellow, where he studies Congress, the administrative state, election reform, and the United States Postal Service. Kevin is the author of many books and articles. His latest book is the edited volume, Congress Overwhelmed. He's also an expert on the history of whiskey, which is not entirely off topic when it comes to the history of the House of Representatives. Okay, next we have former U.S. Representative Dan Lipinski, who's now a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. Dan served the 3rd District of Illinois from 2005 to 2021, working on the Transportation Committee and the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. He also taught American politics as a political scientist at Duke University before joining Congress. Finally, we have Molly Reynolds, Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution, where she studies how congressional rules and procedure affect policies. She is the author of a great book, Exceptions to the Rule, The Politics of Filibuster Limitations in the U.S. Senate. And she also supervises the maintenance of vital statistics on Congress, Brookings' long-running resource on the first branch of government. She's one of our nation's most diligent and thoughtful Congress watchers, I would say. So it's a great group we've gathered together, and I'll soon turn it over to them, but I'll just give a little rundown of what we saw yesterday to get started. So yesterday, the members of the House of Representatives voted for the first time in the institution's 234-year history to remove their speaker from office. At the instigation of Representative Matt Gaetz of Florida, who is probably McCarthy's most vocal Republican critic, 216 members, including all 208 Democrats who were present and 8 Republicans, voted to oust McCarthy. They beat out the 210 other Republicans who were present, all of whom voted to keep McCarthy. To say the least, to put it very mildly, this is very surprising. Efforts to bring down speakers are certainly not novel. The speakership is not a job that lasts forever. But it really is something new for a leader to retain the support of the overwhelming majority of his party and yet be ejected, especially in such a dramatic and uncertain vote on the floor of the House. We've just never seen that before. So McCarthy projected confidence ahead of the vote, and many of us imagined that there would be at least a few Democrats who would not like to see Gaetz take the speaker's scalp right after McCarthy had facilitated a continuing resolution with bipartisan support to avert a government shutdown. And that was on top of a bipartisan debt limit deal earlier this year. But apparently we were wrong. The Democrats believed it was Republicans' problem to figure out who they wanted to support as speaker, and they were comfortable voting as a unified bloc against keeping McCarthy as speaker. So to get some perspective on this, let me start by turning to Matt Green, who has literally written the book on leadership struggles in the House, along with the ones I mentioned before. He's also the co-author with Douglas Harris of Choosing the Leader, which goes into real depth on all manner of leadership struggles in congressional history. So, Matt, put this in historical perspective for us. We've seen leaders fall before, but never in this manner. What's new and different about McCarthy's downfall? What's familiar to you?
Well, thank you, Philip. And before I begin, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel with so many distinguished experts and scholars. And I'm glad to hear I'm not the only one who was surprised by the outcome. I too thought that Democrats would, to at least some degree, come to McCarthy's rescue. So, first of all, this is unprecedented. The House has never done this before. There's only been one other vote to vacate the chair, and it failed. So in some respects, it's hard to look at history as any kind of guidance as to why this happened. But I actually, I think one can make an argument that the vote yesterday, as unprecedented as it was, actually fits a pattern of speaker careers and how those careers end that go back to the mid-1980s, starting with Speaker Jim Wright, a Democrat from Texas, who resigned from the House in 1987. And if you look at how speaker careers have ended from 1987 to now, most of them, actually with one exception, they all either had their careers end because their party lost their majority. They resigned from office, as Jim Wright did. They lost re-election, as what happened to Tom Foley, or this is a new category, they were removed while they were speaker. Only one, Paul Ryan, actually retired. So this is a model that I've called the revolt and rejection model, where speakers see their careers end either because their party is rejected by voters, or they themselves lose support of their party or a majority in the House. So it's a much more unstable career than it could be. And I think this is especially striking if you look at how speaker careers ended before this. If you go back to 1933, Henry Rainey was the first speaker in that period, and then go through Tip O'Neill, whose speakership went through 1987. Every speaker but one in that period saw their career end either because they retired or they died in office. So this is what I've called a career model, or maybe thinking academically, a tenure model, where once you have the job, it's yours as long as you want it and are alive to keep it. So what distinguishes that period from this period? I think a couple of things. One is that you have much more severe competition, much more serious competition for control of the House than you did in the 1930s through the 1980s. So you can't be sure if you're speaker today that your party will even be in the majority after the next election. The other thing that we see in this period from the 80s to now, in both parties, but I think especially in the Republican Party, is internal division and a faction, or an amorphous faction in the case of the current Republican conference, of not just lawmakers who disagree with their colleagues, but are also more disdainful of norms of party conduct. I mean, this rule has been on the books more or less continuously since 1910, and yet members of the majority party knew that they should not try to remove their speaker, as unhappy as they might be with that person, in the middle of a Congress. But what we're seeing, what we saw yesterday, and what we've seen also in recent years, is members of the majority party in the House saying, I'm actually okay trying to use this rule. I don't care if I'm defying party norms. The closest analogy to the period we're in now, I would say, would be from the 1860s through 1933, where most speakers lost their job because their party lost a majority in the House. So that's another period of, like we are in now, heightened party conflicts and party polarization. But again, even then, you didn't see the degree of internal factions or internal divisions that you see in congressional parties today. So I would say that, as unusual as yesterday was, I think in many ways kind of fits a pattern that we've seen since the mid-1980s, where the speakership position is just not as secure as it once was.
What was the phrase used? Revolt and removal?
Revolt and rejection.
Revolt and rejection. I like that a lot. So, Kevin, let me turn to you now. What was the nature of this revolt by Matt Gaetz and his allies? What were they so angry about? Was it something about the legislative process that McCarthy had presided over, or was it the outcomes of his leadership, or both?
Well, it's hard to say. Getting into the hearts of these individuals and what was truly motivating them, good luck with that. I would say that it's worth recalling that for a long time, and Matt Green has written about this, we've had a faction within the GOP in the House who's dissatisfied with the party. They actively run against the party. They view the party as kind of overly willing to bargain with Democrats, as DC insiders. They sometimes denounce them as co-members of the Uniparty. And so Matt Gaetz comes out of that tradition, a guy who runs under the Republican label, but gets into Congress by trashing Republicans. Now, in his case in particular, I've kind of gone back through his various public statements and the like. There seems to be a variety of things that were going on with him. I mean, he very closely allied with Trump, was not pleased that McCarthy called out Trump for the January 6th riot on Capitol Hill. He was also not happy with McCarthy in the 2022 autumn elections, putting funding into campaigns against certain MAGA candidates like Eli Crane. Gaetz also decried McCarthy as a DC insider who was too eager to cut deals with Democrats and to sell out true conservatism. More recently, he was ticked off about the debt deal that McCarthy made with Biden. And I'm sure he was further inflamed by the recent CR. Gaetz, interestingly, started banging the gong about a need to return to regular order with the passage of 12 separate appropriations bills instead of rolling these things together in an omnibus or a cromnibus or something like that. That's been a theme amongst many Republican members. It's not localized to Gaetz or the House Freedom Caucus, but he started banging on that too. And more generally, Gaetz has been just saying very bluntly for a long time, Kevin McCarthy's untrustworthy. I don't trust him. Nobody, he even generalized it to say nobody trusts him. And you couldn't help, as he said these things, getting the feeling that there was something deeply personal about this, that they've had some bad interactions, behind closed doors or elsewhere, that has just left him in an inimical sort of situation. And so he pulled the trigger yesterday. And yeah, as you highlighted at the beginning, I think it was quite astonishing. I mean, the overwhelming membership of the GOP voted to keep McCarthy, just as they voted for him back in January. And yesterday it was 8 GOP dissidents who were able to topple him with the help of a whole lot of Democrats.
Yeah. So let's talk about those Democrats now. Kevin McCarthy lost his job not just because of 8 Republicans, but because all 208 Democrats who were at the Capitol yesterday also voted against him. So what were they thinking? Let's turn to Dan Lipinski, their former colleague, for your take.
Well, thank you, Phil, for having me. I'm teaching I'm a fellow at the University of Dallas. That's where I am today. And this all was going on while I was teaching a Congress class. And I was trying to tell my students, emphasize how historic this is. I mean, historic is overused, but it's the only time this has ever happened in the history of the United States Congress. I think it's a terrible day for Congress, for the institution, and I think we can get into that some more later on if I was going to be as pessimistic as I sometimes want to be. I'd say this was another nail in the coffin of our republic, and a lot of that gets back to Phil, what you wrote about in your book. But Democrats, you heard Democrats come out and say, well, we were unhappy with what Kevin McCarthy said on Face the Nation on Sunday, that we didn't like that he went after Democrats, that they didn't want to pass this continuing resolution on Saturday to keep the government funded. I went back and I hadn't seen it. I looked at the transcript this morning, and that clearly was just an excuse. I mean, Kevin McCarthy did not say anything out of the ordinary in terms of, well, he did say Democrats didn't want to pass it. They did want to pass it, but look, that was an excuse. What I assume happened is Democrats decided it was in their short-term partisan electoral interest to cause chaos with amongst Republicans, to help contribute to chaos amongst Republicans. I think the 8 Republicans who did this are incredibly irresponsible. I think the Democrats, though, were irresponsible also. It's not only not good for the institution, but what signal was this sending? It was saying, Democrats were saying, okay, we wanted this clean CR to pass. All of us except one of us voted for it. Kevin McCarthy did it. He took on those, where it finally was 8 members who were going to take him down. He took them on, and instead of Democrats helping Kevin McCarthy and saying, good, you did the right thing here, we're going to support you in this because we want to encourage you to again take on the crazies in your party. Instead, they joined those same crazies to oust McCarthy and essentially say to any future Republican speaker, well, we say we want you to go after those crazy members of your party, whatever you want to call them. Boehner used to call them the Knucklehead Caucus. We want you to go after them and work with us, but here, when you do it, we're gonna oust you. Help oust you. I just think that was bad. I thought it was very interesting that Kevin McCarthy said in his press conference, which I thought was really interesting yesterday. This is a man who was unburdened and was able to say a lot of things that he had wanted to say in the past. But one thing that he said was he spoke to Nancy Pelosi, and when the rules were being changed earlier this Congress so that it only took 1 member to bring up the motion to vacate, I was part of the Problem Solvers Caucus in 2018. We helped change that rule. We asked for that rule to change to half of the conference or caucus of the speaker had to support a motion to vacate before it was brought to the floor. So it was different for 4 years. Some of these Republicans demanded that it be changed back to 1 member could bring it. And so Kevin McCarthy was saying yesterday, I talked to Nancy Pelosi about it, and Pelosi told me, don't worry, if someone in your conference brings up a motion to vacate, I'll have your back. Meaning Democrats will support the speaker. They will not vote to oust him. Now, very interesting to me, back in 2015, when John Boehner was threatened, Mark Meadows threatened him, had a motion to vacate, was never brought to the floor. Boehner beat him to it by resigning. The day before Boehner resigned, I was in Speaker Boehner's office with him, and we were talking about Nancy Pelosi. And Boehner didn't say directly, but he really suggested that Pelosi had given him that promise, that she would, if Meadows and others came after him with the motion to vacate, that Pelosi would instruct her members in the Democratic caucus to vote against ousting him. So this really fits with what McCarthy said, fits with that. I think Nancy Pelosi is an institutionalist. I think he would have if he were still the Democratic leader had told Democrats to support the speaker, don't vote to oust him. But I think for Jeffries, the Democratic leader, I think this was a situation where maybe because he's new, he needed to show that he could rally all the Democrats together and that they're all going to vote in unison on this. And he had some members who were never going to vote to save McCarthy. And in the end, he decided there are just a lot of reasons to just say to members, just all vote yes on the motion to vacate. And that's what they did. I think it's bad for the institution in the short term and in the long term.
Do you have any thoughts on what the Democrats imagined they were getting more in the short term? Like, McCarthy is out, but we don't know who's going to come next. We'll talk about that more in a few minutes, but just sort of on the Democrats' thinking, do you think that was important to them, or just sort of making McCarthy fall was a good enough outcome that they don't care that much about that?
It's all about the next election. That's all that matters. And look, the Republicans, I think if the shoe was on the other foot, I think the Republicans would have done the same thing. I'm not calling out Democrats for doing this. I think they would have done the same thing. It would have been the wrong thing for Republicans to do also in a situation like this if Democrats were in the majority, Democratic speaker. But I think they're just looking at the next election. And it's really, if you go back, though, it's folly to believe that this kind of chaos is going to mean that Republicans necessarily do terribly in the next election. It doesn't help,
Right.
but that's so far away still. And we've seen things like this happen before,
Right.
where things really then turned around. We forget about it very quickly.
Right. We can think back to the October 2013 shutdown, which was really very embarrassing for Republicans in many ways, but didn't keep them from doing so well in the 2014 midterm. So we have the prospect of chaos in the House now, maybe, but we also have something new in place. We have a Speaker pro tempore, Patrick McHenry of North Carolina. Nobody else has taken on precisely this role, and there's a lot of uncertainty about what this job entails. So let me turn to Molly Reynolds. Where did this role come from, Molly, and how did McHenry get the job, and what can he do with it?
Sure. Sure. So about 20 years ago, in 2003, the House adopted some new rules in response to the kind of continuity challenges that had been highlighted by September 11th. So, as everyone knows, we narrowly averted a sort of real catastrophe from a continuity perspective at the Capitol on September 11th. And so as part of a broader effort to try and make sure that Congress was well situated in the event of some sort of mass incapacitating event, there was a task force led by Martin Frost, a Democrat, Chris Cox, a Republican, to recommend some rules changes. And one of them was this change to require the Speaker of the House at the beginning of the Congress and then at appropriate times thereafter to give the Clerk of the House a list of members who would act as Speaker pro tem if there was a vacancy in the office of the Speaker. So this rules change was imagined, designed to address the kind of situation that we almost had on September 11th. But there it is on the books. There is this list that McCarthy sent to the Clerk of the House at the beginning of the Congress. And so when a vacancy arose yesterday as the result of the vote on a question of the privileges to vacate the chair, there was this moment where Steve Womack had been presiding over the House, and then up the steps walks Patrick McHenry of North Carolina. That's how we learn that he was the first person on McCarthy's list. And so he is now, as Phil said, the Speaker pro tem. The language of the rule itself isn't entirely clear on what powers the Speaker pro tem has, whether it's all of the powers of the office of the Speaker or sort of just authorities that allow him to effectuate a new election for Speaker. there people who think about these things come down on both sides of the issue. I would put myself in the camp that the Speaker Pro Tem McHenry sort of has the full powers of the speakership, with the possible exception of sitting in the line of succession. My sort of logic there is that given how this rule was originally designed, which was to allow someone to act as speaker in the event of a real crisis, that you would not necessarily have wanted to develop a rule that would limit that person's power in kind of an actual emergency. But McHenry at least appears at this point to be behaving like he has more limited power. So he recessed the House yesterday. It's been reported that he's not planning to refer bills to committee, which is one of the powers of the speakership. He has said, at least at this point, that they don't intend to hold votes again until after the election of a new speaker. It's all pretty untested, and it may well be the case that McHenry's choice to act in this more limited way is a political one. Ultimately, there are political constraints in addition to any procedural ones on his exercise of the speaker's powers. But I will just say that it makes me a little nervous from a continuity perspective. When we're in uncharted territory like we are right now, anything becomes possible precedent for the future. When the precedents are silent, really any new precedent is something that could be pointed to in the future. And in the kind of situation that this rule originally anticipated, a true sort of catastrophic emergency, I think we would probably want the person acting as Speaker Pro Tem to have more expansive powers that it seems like McHenry is at least planning at this moment to exercise.
So Molly, let me stick with you for a second. What is McHenry probably going to attempt just in the coming days?
Yeah. So
he took the podium and dismissed everybody for the week. But sort of most Republicans who voted to keep McCarthy, what do you think that they're hoping will happen next week?
So it's been reported that the Republican conference plans to hold a candidates forum on Tuesday, where they will hear from various folks who would like to put their names in the running to be the next speaker. And then the hope is to go to the floor and have an election on Wednesday. That would I think the operating assumption should be that will look like the election procedurally, like the election back in January, where they call the roll of the House. I'll remind folks that that's not required. Like, we could have a different approach to electing the speaker, and as long as we're entertaining new procedural innovations and hypotheticals, we certainly could see something different. But I think, to sort of more directly answer your question, Phil, I think kind of the center of gravity in the House Republican Conference would like to select someone as quickly as possible and move on to trying to, say, pass individual appropriations bills. So the House Republicans had laid out this schedule for themselves last week, where they were going to try to move additional individual appropriations bills over the month of October. Majority Leader Scalise had canceled the October recess so that they could do this. And I think the folks who are kind of, again, McCarthy supporters, people who are really occupy the majority of the conference, would just like to settle this as much as possible and move on to, again, trying to do the business of the House.
Right. So let's think about what that looks like, doing the business of the House. Of course, the first order of business is these spending bills, right? We are going to have a government shutdown over Thanksgiving if we're not successful at getting spending bills passed, or another continuing resolution perhaps. So what do the prospects look like for that now? Let's say we get a new speaker. Let's put aside for a second the question of who that would be. I certainly think, Representative Steve Scalise, who's the second in command, does seem like a logical choice, although he's got the struggling with having to beat blood cancer right now. But let's say Scalise or somebody else becomes speaker. What are the prospects for getting these bills passed? They just have an example now where doing a deal with Democrats, passing a big bipartisan bill, leads to the loss of a job. It leads to getting voted out dramatically on the floor. what's to stop these eight renegade Republicans from joining up with Democrats again in a month and a half? Surely that will be on the speaker's mind in any case. So any of you three gentlemen, what want to jump in? What do you think about where this is going? Kevin, how about you?
Yeah, there's a tension in the dissident faction between a demand for regular order and individual appropriations bills coming out and bills that actually do what they would prefer, which is to reduce the scope of government and all that. And, just because you follow regular order doesn't mean you're going to get small government bills. In fact, you may get the opposite of that as you try to build up a majority. And so as those bills, can get reported out, then they're going to hit the Rules Committee, where guess what? The HFC does have some sway these days. And are they willing to put these bills on the floor as they stand, or are they going to try to transform them and in the process doing it antagonize the chairs who did the work to get them there? So I don't know. I don't know if they can pull this off. It's going to be difficult for them to try to get these things through, on this short deadline. And I think it's clear that there are some legislators in the GOP who are perfectly happy to shut down the government. I mean, it's kind of a heads we win, tails we win. If they get a bill through that's a small government bill, they win. If a bill is too big for their likings, then they shut the government down over it and then go back to their kind of primary voters and say, look, I stood up for principle, and besides, we don't need government. So they win on that count. So it's going to be tough, I think. That'd be my take.
Matt, what do you think? Is a new leader likely to get any kind of honeymoon sort of tolerance, or is he just going to have inheriting McCarthy's problems directly?
Well, the first thing I'll say is just to Kevin Kosar's point. Yesterday during the debate, Tom Massey of Kentucky made the exact same point, which I think is a really good one, which is that there's these two competing, in some ways contradictory impulses by some of these rebels, that they want regular order, but they also want certain conservative outcomes. And that is not going to go away with the new leader. And the overall political context won't change. You're still going to probably have this rule on the books. You're still going to have a very small Republican majority. You're still going to have sort of this fluid faction, or factions, if you will, in the Republican Party. So any new leader is going to have the same struggles. My guess would be, I don't know if I'd call it a honeymoon period, and a lot will depend on who that new leader is and how many ballots it takes to elect them. But presuming that it's somebody that the Republican conference more or less unanimously supports, I think there is probably a small window for the next speaker to be able to get things through. And even if that requires cooperating with Democrats and the president, which it almost certainly will, that it won't necessarily end their speakership. But I do think that in terms of the practical politics, whoever the new speaker is going to have to figure out how to keep the coalition that McCarthy built, which is impressive. I mean, we talk about the House Freedom Caucus, but most of the House Freedom Caucus voted for McCarthy in the first place, and they did not vote to vacate the chair. So you've got this very small group, and so you could possibly peel off 4 or 5 of those members, especially those who just don't like McCarthy personally. And then the new speaker would have this organizational cartel, this majority that would maintain him if there were another vote to vacate, even if all Democrats voted to remove the speaker. But on the other hand, I think the challenge is they have different reasons. So, Congresswoman Nancy Mace has her grievances, and Gaetz has his grievances. Rosendale has his grievances, or in some cases, it's not really grievances. It's just, as you heard from Congressman Lipinski, it's just about reelection. And they'll just want to go against the establishment no matter what. So I think in the short run, whoever the new speaker is can conceivably maintain that coalition, add a few more members, and maintain their authority. But over the next year in the 3 or 4 months, they're going to have the same challenges that McCarthy did.
Matthew, you're being generous here. I would love to see a lot of these Republicans who claim they want regular order. I want to see someone say to them, look, what you're asking for is you want regular order and you want a very conservative bill. You want a bill that cuts a lot of government spending. With regular order, you cannot have that. It is not possible. I've been hearing this since 2011 from some Republicans that they think, oh, they'll say we need regular order. And they must truly understand that they don't have a majority of the House even with them, much less the Senate. So those obviously do not go together. Letting everyone have their say in the House and getting the type of legislation that these members want. I'd like to see those members confronted on it. Now, okay, if it's Steve Scalise, at first I thought he was not going to run because of his health issues, but apparently he would like to be Speaker. He is well liked. That will be helpful. If there are 8 Republicans who will vote for a motion to vacate, who are willing to take that step against a Republican Speaker, it's possible then that 4 of those could be placated, and that's not going to be a problem down the line. But look, here's the thing. The Republicans it wasn't Kevin McCarthy preventing the House Republicans from passing the appropriations bills. I mean, I kept hearing that yesterday. Kevin McCarthy was preventing it. No, they couldn't get 218 votes to pass them out of the Republican conference. That was a problem. And again, Republicans are making these demands, but if you don't have 218, you can't do it. So I think a lot of people missed before October 1st the fact that when we've had shutdowns before, it something and sent it to the Senate. It was something crazy that the Senate was not going to ever accept, but they did pass a funding bill to keep the government open. This time, Republicans could not even pass anything, no matter how much there wasn't cuts. It's still in border funding and all kinds of other things. It still cannot get 218 Republican votes. You're still going to have that problem in the House. Again, just for the House portion of spending. And then you're going to need Democrats in the end to keep the government functioning, to pass something that out of the House eventually that can pass the Senate. You're going to need Democrats in the House. It's still a long, long road, and no one knows how we're going to get there. And so this only makes the whole government funding and keeping the government from shutting down makes it more difficult.
Yeah, it sometimes seems like these folks get distracted from the fact that they're members of a legislature that ultimately has to pass laws with majorities of 2 chambers and get the signature of the president. I mean, Republicans didn't have an ask here, let alone an ask that could sort of plausibly feed into negotiations, as they did in fact manage to come up with in the debt ceiling struggle earlier in the year. Yeah, Dan.
Well, I was just going to say, you're just getting at my frustration that I had. That look, I think some members of the House don't want to be in the legislature. They never want to be in the legislature. They just want to perform. As Yuval Levin has a great book on that, about all our institutions have crumbled, have failed because people want to use them to perform rather than be formed by them. And that's certainly Congress, especially the House, is that way. But yeah, it's a great frustration. What do you do when you have people who won't accept the fact that they want to be elected to the House of Representatives? You need 218 votes to do anything, but somehow they think that they can, or they're acting as if somehow they don't need 218 votes. I have no idea what they're thinking. Incredibly frustrating, and that's what any new Republican speaker is going to have to go through.
Molly.
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that you're really hearing from these comments, and I agree with almost everything that's been said, is just the challenges of governing a conference where some faction of the conference is not ultimately driven by a desire to govern. And so I think that, and, you know, people like to contrast sort of McCarthy's experience with Pelosi's experience. And I don't think that's always a particularly useful comparison, in part because on this, I think the parties are just kind of fundamentally different. And I think that the way that Pelosi or any other Democratic speaker manages the Democratic caucus is by sort of making trade-offs between competing policy goals. What I think one of the challenges that faced McCarthy, and a challenge that's going to face his successor, whoever it is that it is when you try to make sort of trade-offs and concessions within the Republican conference, it's not always possible to do that from a policy perspective. And, you know, folks mention this in the context of government spending, which is that if you sort of try to pass an appropriations bill that is embraced by those on the right end of the conference, you're going to lose votes from the left end of the conference. And so you can't, it's a much different political struggle to manage those differences in the conference. And as other folks have said, like, that's not going to go away for whoever is the next Speaker of the House. And in some ways, the stakes of all of this are going to get higher the longer we go into the fiscal year. So continuing resolutions are bad. They're a bad way to govern. They are bad for federal agencies. They create a lot of uncertainty. We should not embrace them. But doing one at the beginning of the fiscal year to buy a little bit of time is different than getting into like November or December and facing down the prospect of either a full year continuing resolution if you can't ultimately resolve the appropriations process, or a long shutdown that far into the fiscal year. That is, to my sort of budget mind, demonstrably worse than sort of what we managed to do over the weekend, which was buy a little bit more time to hopefully be able to make more progress on the spending bills.
And there is an added wrinkle on full year continuing resolution, right? Which is that
there is, that as part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, so the law to raise the debt ceiling, if on January 1st, any part of the government, so if any of the 12 appropriations bills are not finished, there is an automatic 1% cut across the board, even to elements of the discretionary budget where Congress did finish its work. Now, that doesn't actually it kicks in if we have a CR for any part of the federal government on January 1st. It doesn't actually take effect until April, so they have a little bit more time. But the idea of that provision was to have this sort of Damocles, this kind of big consequence for Congress if they didn't get things done. I remain somewhat hopeful that it still works as intended, in part because, particularly for the defense side of the budget, that 1% cut would be sort of a real anathema to the remaining Republican defense hawks, both in the House and especially in the Senate. They really don't want to see that happen. Right. And so I hope that still drives folks to some sort of consensus outcome. Excuse me. But one thing that we should take away from this episode is that, if we think what Kevin McCarthy did over the weekend was the right thing, that does not necessarily save him or any future speaker from punishment from a dissident faction of his own conference, even though ultimately it might be like the right choice for the government and for the country.
But so would be fair to imagine probably that Gaetz and others who are sort of anti-spending and not defense hawks would probably take it as a big win if they manage to force us into continued reliance on continuing resolutions through continued speaker chaos, and then they could take that as a bigger really policy win than anything else they had ever managed to push through. So I do think,
I'd say though, I'd also just note the irony of repeatedly calling for regular order in the appropriations process,
right,
and then also ultimately making a series of choices that drive towards a like even more irregular order than usual outcome, which would be to have this automatic cut for even parts of the budget where they had finished their work.
Right. So let's
but Molly, you're just assuming rationality, and you're assuming that, I mean, no one's going to call them on this. No one's going to call them on the fact that they're saying things that don't make any sense, that don't fit together. That's the really dangerous part about this. You have members who will say one thing and they're doing exactly the other, and it doesn't impact them. And no one calls them on it. It doesn't hurt them in any way. They get up, they're able to get on cable news and say what they want to say. I mean, I've heard a lot of it last night. It just did not make sense. Two things they said were contradictory to each other, but they weren't self-evidently, self-evidently contradictory to each other. But we know that you can't have regular order and these big cuts. They don't go together. And you can't demand regular order, but at the same time, you're the ones who are refusing to go along with it. That's what happens.
Okay, we are coming to the time in our program where we're going to turn to audience questions. Just a reminder, you can email Elizabeth Buckles at aei.org or tweet with the hashtag. I know I've forgotten exactly what it was. Next for the House, I think. And you can find both of those things on the webpage that this should be streaming on for most of you. So please submit those. Let me turn to one that I've gotten already, which is helpfully directing us toward the big picture. So what does this mean for the balance of power of the different sort of layers of operation in the House? You know, we came out of the Nancy Pelosi speakership from 2019 to 2023, where everyone understood that the Democrats were very, very solidly behind Nancy Pelosi. She, of course, never faced any kind of challenge like the one we've just seen with McCarthy. I think Dan would be the first to agree that she was a very feared figure in the Democratic caucus. And as a result, she was able to run the House in a rather top-down manner that caused some of us to have some real qualms. We don't have a very strong speaker anymore. If that wasn't blindingly obvious to everyone before yesterday, it ought to be now. If the speaker is weaker, are committees going to be stronger? Is the average House member going to be stronger? Is it just the Matt Gaetz 8 that's stronger? Where do we find ourselves as we go forward? Let me turn to Matt Green to start. Gotta unmute.
Yeah. Okay. I was trying to buy myself a few seconds to try to answer that very big and complicated question. I think we're in a real transition period right now. It's not just a transition from one speaker to another. It's a period where you have all of these competing pressures, and as Congressman Lipinski put it, you've got members who want regular order. Okay, so that would suggest giving the speaker fewer powers, and to some degree, that's what happened as a price that McCarthy had to pay to get elected in January. But then you also have this competing ideological desire to get certain outcomes. I think and I'll just say this, I think what's interesting to the point that Congressman Lipinski made, and Congressman Massey was trying to say this on the floor yesterday, if you contrast it with the 1970s, where you had reformers on the liberal end of the spectrum pushing for more power to leadership and less power to committees, it actually coincided with their policy goals, because committee chairs tended to be conservative. So they said, we'll get both. We'll get more centralized power, weaker chairs, and that's better for the institution, and we'll also get the outcomes we want. But, to the point that Congressman Lipinski was making, how do you have regular order if you're not likely to get the outcomes that you want? So I don't know how that battle is going to play out. And I think it's not just the speaker's formal powers that matter, it's their informal influence. So yes, Pelosi had a lot of formal powers, but she also, and I was not in Congress, obviously, Congressman Lipinski can speak to this, but she had, ability to persuade, she had gravitas, she could convey a sense of fear among members. I just don't see anybody in the Republican conference doing that. They have a very shallow bench to draw upon. And so all that might mean that things get more decentralized in the House. But on the other hand, if it results in the word chaos, as we hear so often now, where nothing gets done, then maybe members will say, you know what, forget regular order. Let's make a speaker more powerful. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't really know what the next step is. And I think that we're in this key kind of point, decision point where the House, and particularly House Republicans, can go in any of a number of directions.
Kevin, let me turn to you next.
Yeah. Matt set me up very nicely because, one thing that's not been talked about much so far in the conversation about Kevin McCarthy is the fact that he was a tremendous fundraiser. He raised gobs and gobs of money for his party, just as Pelosi had done. That's one of the duties of the modern speaker, is to be this sort of cash cow. And the GOP dissidents just killed that cash cow. And I wonder, inside the GOP conference, how many members are seething about that, because many of them are heavily reliant upon the speaker to raise money for them. And there's also, I wonder if a lot of them, who supported McCarthy through and through, are just going to have sore heads, which leads to the question, are we going to get a reaction against this by both parties who say, wow, this idea of taking power away from the speaker and, letting more people into the room to kind of try to co-direct things, it's led to this moment. We're going to push back and give more power back to the speaker, maybe tighten up the rule to vacate, et cetera, because we can't allow this to happen again, because this is an embarrassment. So yeah, who knows which way this is going to go.
A lot of uncertainty.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't think this has anything to do with taking any formal powers away from the speaker, though. I think that the big problem is that the Republicans, since their big landslide in 2010, when they took over the House, they're not one party, they're two parties. And on top of it, the difference between Democrats and Republicans, you have your left, your progressives in the Democratic Party. They are to the left of the rest of the caucus, but they still want to get something done. Republican Party, you have those are to the right of the Republican conference, but they're happy not for nothing to happen. And that's why I think Democrats eventually come together, because everyone wants to do something there. But if you're a Republican, there are Republicans who are just as happy to say, hey, I stopped things from happening. And that's the problem that the Republicans have. It's a fundamental problem inside the Republican Party that has not been solved. And despite all that, despite them having all these problems since 2011, they've held the House for all but 4 years there. So I'm not sure what that says about Democrats either. So yeah, I was always one. I wanted to take power away from the speaker, and I want to give power to the members, to the committees to actually work. I'm not sure if that was going on under too much under Speaker McCarthy or not. I think there's just dynamics in the party, that the Republican Party, that make it so hard to get anything done, no matter what.
Yeah, I just want to really underscore something Congressman Lipinski just said, which is that for me, for this to usher in an era of a more decentralized House, we really need the prospect of fluid policy coalitions And the fact that the faction within the Republican conference that is sort of most unhappy and most willing to buck Republican leaders is on the right end of the conference. Really, like, those two things don't square for me. I have sort of trouble imagining how we could get from those dissidents on a lot of sort of any real policy questions to some faction of the Democrats working together on driven by policy. And for me, that's kind of a precondition of a more decentralized House. The other thing that I'll note on kind of what was happening under Speaker McCarthy vis-a-vis committees is that if you listen to Democrats talk about the sort of things that were very frustrating to them about Speaker McCarthy that contributed to their choice to participate in his ouster yesterday. What for some of them, it includes what happened with the National Defense Authorization Act over the summer, which was this piece of legislation that had been developed on a bipartisan basis in the Armed Services Committee. It came out of the Armed Services Committee 58-1. And so it really was committee driven and had folks from both sides of the aisle on board with it. And then again, under pressure from the right end of the conference, sort of House leadership opened it up to any number of very sort of conservative policy writers, things that were really meant to be kind of red meat to the elements of the conference that basically made it very difficult for it to get that level of bipartisan support on the floor itself. So I think we have from this Congress alone examples of ways that in the current environment, it's still quite difficult to try to empower committees even a little bit because these broader partisan dynamics can kind of overrule what's happening.
Let me go to the next question. Maybe I'll try to combine a couple and then send it back to all of you. So one audience member writes specifically about the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is this bipartisan group, really the sort of best institutionalized bipartisan group that exists in the House. She writes, or he, I'm actually not sure. Does the decision of members of the Problem Solvers Caucus not to save McCarthy demonstrate a commitment to partisanship over problem solving? Let me throw that to you, Dan. You're a former member of that group. What do you feel about that? And then I'll go back. And then I'll sort of zoom out to a bigger question about sort of the potential for bipartisanship in the House. Got it.
Unmute. All right, my earpiece was going out there also. It really, well, yesterday there were reports that the Republicans and the Problem Solvers Caucus, just back up a bit. The Problem Solvers Caucus is a bipartisan group of House members. It's been even Democrats, Republicans, been kept that way, meet every week, talk about what they can work on together in a bipartisan manner. Back in 2019, 2018, we actually came up with a couple of bills, one on healthcare, one on immigration reform, but couldn't get them to the floor because the rules don't allow anything like that. And at the time in 18, Speaker Ryan was not going to let a bipartisan group of members bring something to the floor, even though it probably would have had a majority. Problem Solvers Caucus, unfortunately, I think this was an opportunity for Democrats to step up there. And I hate to say this because those are a lot of friends of mine who are still there, but the Problem Solvers Caucus Democrats should have stepped up and said, okay, here we're gonna do the right thing. And so yesterday, a lot of Republicans and Problem Solvers Caucus said they're considering all resigning from the caucus, essentially ending the caucus. I don't think that will happen, but it was a great missed opportunity and seemed to suggest, and unfortunately, I have to say, is the case, just the partisan pull and partisanship is just destroying the House of Representatives, if it hasn't already. And I've written and talked a lot about this. I'll just say it here
again, there is not a major piece of legislation that has become law in the last 13 years that has not come almost exclusively out of the Senate, because the House cannot govern. The House is a messaging body. It's not a legislature anymore. They pass partisan messaging bills, and that is a major problem for the country.
Okay, yeah. Molly had to go. That was pre-scheduled. She didn't just drop off the face of the earth, I'm pleased to say.
I didn't just say something that annoyed her so much.
No. Okay, so let's keep going on this theme, but broaden it out a little. I have a question from our friend Daniel Stidd, now of Lyceum Labs. Daniel asks, given the hardliners' insistence that regular order is something that they desire, is there any chance that a new speaker would come out and say, I'm just completely for regular order above all else, and I'm going to make that the institution's hallmark and use that as a way to actually break the logjam and force the hardliners to actually participate in a debate that maybe they can't win? So would that be a way of modeling a new kind of leadership from the speakership going forward? What do you think? Matt, how about you?
I mean, my short answer is no. I think, though, I love the idea, and I think I for one think that it would be a huge benefit to the House, to echo what everyone else in the panel has been saying, that I think regular order is a good thing inherently for the institution. It's just historically, it's very hard to find examples where you have major institutional change that isn't also connected to desired policy outcomes. So if the next speaker is elected solely by Republicans, as is almost certain, it's hard to imagine that person saying, yes, I support regular order, because it means you're going to have an open process in committee and on the floor. And yeah, sometimes folks on the left, liberals, are going to win, and you just have to accept that. If we were to see a more unlikely outcome, like a coalition speaker or even a speaker elected by Democrats and a minority of Republicans, then I would expect to see that speaker entertain that kind of leadership and say, yes, we want an open process. Interestingly, we do see that happening sometimes at the state level. In state legislatures, that happens. In places like Alaska, for example, where you have these minority leaders or minority coalition leaders. That is just not something that we've really seen in Congress and in the House, and it would require that minority party to support that speaker, even if they're the other party. It would raise questions about these other things that speakers do, like Kevin Kosar mentioned, like fundraising. Their partisan role would come into question. So I don't think that's going to happen, but I do think that if we wanted a speaker who was governing that way, it would need to be a speaker who was truly elected by some either bipartisan coalition or a party that is far less polarized than the parties are in Congress today.
I could see a new speaker as part of the deal basically saying, yeah, fine, all 12 appropriation bills have to come through. When it comes to all the other bills, all the authorizations, they might fudge on that. And we might see what we've been seeing so far this year, which is, yeah, there are plenty of closed rules. And there are plenty of things being done via the Rules Committee to kind of control the amount of debate that might occur on particular pieces of legislation. But feels to me like it would be a very unstable arrangement, not least because any one of those 12 appropriations bills have a high probability of getting tripped up and amended from the floor in a way that's going to upset the majority conference or one thing or another, and therefore may not get across the line, which again triggers either partial government shutdown or lengthy negotiations with the Senate, because we can't forget that we got Democratic control in the Senate. So even if the House gets something through and Republicans are feeling pretty good about it, they got to cut a deal with the Senate, and the Senate's just not going to wholly cave to them, to say nothing of the president.
Up until
Okay, go ahead.
I say on appropriations, Kevin brought up appropriations. Up until a few years ago, appropriations bills were traditionally open rules. you can offer any amendment you wanted on the House floor. Anyone could. You couldn't add more spending without subtracting it from somewhere else. But it was an open rule. Now the appropriators really leaned very heavily to defeat anything they really didn't want. But if you did have an open rule now on appropriations bills, there will be amendments that are offered that will get passed with Democratic support, and then they will make the bills unpalatable to some of the Freedom Caucus members in the Republican Party. They won't vote for them, and Democrats, unless they're let in, unless these bills come out of the Appropriations Committee in a bipartisan manner, Democrats aren't going to vote for them, and they're going to go down. I mean, I'd love to see regular order. We tried to get that done. The Problem Solvers Caucus were pushing for that and demanding that whoever the new speaker was coming in after the 2018 election, the Democrats wound up getting the majority because Speaker Ryan had already announced he was leaving. So we knew it was going to be a new speaker. We put forth a set of rules that we said we want any new speaker candidate needs to agree to these before we agree to vote for them. And actually, I'm working at you mentioned I'm a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. There's a new Center for Revitalizing American Institutions. And I'm going to be working there on a project on revitalizing Congress. And one thing is we're probably going to be putting together a committee to draft up what rules changes we think would be helpful to revitalize Congress as a policymaking body. And the problem is getting members of Congress, getting politicians to actually want to make the institution work.
Yeah, I'll just put in a word on the question of what happens when you do allow amendments on these appropriations bills, right? There tends to be so much sort of pent up demand for getting things out there right now that you get all kinds of riders offered. And we saw that in recent weeks, we saw Republicans attaching things like provisions to reduce the Secretary of Defense's salary to $1, getting added to an appropriation bill, right? With presumably that's a poison pill that means that bill is not going to have any chance of passing into law in its form. So we have the desire to do amendments and let us have open debate, but at the same time, sort of the hazard of that being that it may make things hard to handle in a way that actually moves things toward final legislation. So that's the challenge. Let me ask a question that somebody threw out, which is a little offbeat. The House, of course, is not a universe unto itself. It's all this drama with the speakership is playing out also in the context of presidential primary contests that's afoot. Maybe we have the sense that those presidential primary contests are not very going to be close affairs, but there's a factional struggle going on in the Republican Party. I think it would be fair to say. We have definitely a lot of pro-Trump people lining up in favor of saving McCarthy yesterday. But how does this ongoing presidential primary and this larger factional struggle in the GOP get affected by Kevin McCarthy having been ousted, or struggles to see who's going to be the next speaker going forward? Any thoughts on that?
I'll just say quickly, I think, McCarthy was criticized quite widely and at least to some degree, I think, fairly for wedding himself to Trump, even after the January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol. And it may have allowed him to be speaker. I don't know. I tend to think Trump's influence over House members can be overstated. But I was thinking about this earlier. If McCarthy had said, I don't like Trump, criticized him, said that he's rogue, he shouldn't be elected president, and then this happened, that would have been used as part of the narrative to say, see, Trump really does control the GOP. He can even decide who the speaker is. So the fact that McCarthy, who is a close Trump ally, still could not keep his speakership either suggests that Trump's influence over the House GOP is not as great as people think, and over the Republican Party in general, possibly, or it's just a data point. It doesn't really tell us that much because it's really an internal battle, as so many of these leadership struggles in Congress are.
Yeah, it feels to me that, there's this faction of the Republican Party that's been around for quite a while, who they really want to transform the party itself. This is a long project to reorient the party away from a neoliberalist, consensualist sort of nature. That's how they're kind of framing their attacks upon the party. And I wonder how many kind of members of that faction and supporters of that faction, the donors for them, are kind of whooping and cheering. I mean, yesterday was a big scalp to get, and it sends a very glaring message. The other side, the non kind of MAGA, non-HFC members, not to say that all the HFC was in on this, but those members have to be alarmed, they have to be angry, and they have to be asking themselves, like, how are we going to get through this next election and try to augment our numbers? I mean, there was a story the other day that, Matt Rosendale openly wished that the GOP in the last election would only have a small margin. That way this faction could exert a greater influence. That's perfectly rational, but it also has to be quite upsetting if you're in the party and you're trying to max out your numbers, which is what parties tend to do when they're going into election. So it's going to be a fight. It's going to be a long fight, I feel.
Well, one thing though, I'm not sure, I'm not sure what MAGA Republican means. No one really does. It just sounds nasty because it's Donald Trump connected. But if you listen to these members who voted to Republicans who voted out McCarthy, all they're talking about is, we need to cut spending. That's not Donald Trump. I mean, that's the opposite of Donald Trump. So ideological, I'm not sure what the ideology is here. I remember Tom Massey, and I think you said this publicly, so I don't think I'm giving anything away. That just a private comment to me. Is he at one point he said to me, and we've talked about him before, a representative from Kentucky. He's an MIT PhD engineer, incredibly brilliant guy, libertarian. I don't necessarily agree with him on a lot of things, but Massey said, yeah, I used to think that these Republicans, some of these Republican voters were, that they really had an ideology. Then I realized they just want crazy. They're just looking for crazy. And so that's what they're going to get. Ideology, I'm not really sure where all this really plays in.
Let me throw it out to all of you for one last question as we wind up. You kind of got to give me your 30-second blurbs here as we come to the end of our time. So we have a question from John Ward of Yahoo News. How did we get here over the past 10 or 15 years? And I will throw on top of that, where are we going? Any final thoughts from the panelists at the end of this great discussion?
I'll just start real quickly. I think there's good books out there that answer that question, including Philip's book about the evolution of Congress and parties. You can trace this back, if we look just at the GOP, at least to Gingrich, and I think earlier, where you have the election of folks who believe that, the goal is power, the goal is to have a majority, the goal is communication. As Congressman Lipinski said, the goal is not necessarily legislating. And that kind of objective and that way of viewing one's political career gets certain folks elected who they may have genuine views and beliefs and ideological preferences, but they also don't see Congress as a place to resolve differences and legislate. And that's in many ways, why we are where we are today, I think.
I would say we got here in part due to the fact of narrow margins. If a red wave had come in last autumn and, McCarthy had 25 votes to play with, it'd be a very different scenario. But that's what we've seen in recent Congresses, is this narrowing of the party majorities down to these slim amounts, which just it kind of invites this sort of thing. And why do we have that? Well, that's a much, much larger story, and there's plenty of good books on that.
Dan, final thought?
I agree with Kevin. This specific instance would not have happened if not for these narrow majorities. But I think bigger picture, American politics is broken. The institution is broken. The institution of Congress, especially the House. Philip Wallach's book, Why Congress, is a book I wish I would have written. I assign it to my students this semester. If we're looking at the breakdown of our democracy, we should spend a whole lot more time looking at what has happened to Congress and how Congress does not work, again, especially the House. That's where our republic is going to fail, is because Congress is not doing its constitutional job. Members of Congress do not care about the institution anymore. That is a big change. How we get back, again, read Philip's book. He has different ways that we could possibly go. When it comes to speaker, my best guess is Steve Scalise will be speaker. My dream is that the Dems and the Problem Solvers Caucus try to redeem themselves. They support a Republican, get a moderate Republican speaker. The House gets back to working again.
Well, everyone can dream. So thank you so much to our panelists for taking part in this. Thank you all in the audience for tuning in. And thank you to those who tune in at a later date on YouTube as well. So with that, I'll bring this program to a close. Thank you so much.